The warehouse reeked of motor oil and decades of Philadelphia rain that had seeped through corrugated steel. Dutch's footsteps echoed against concrete as he moved deeper into the shadows, the briefcase handle slick with sweat despite the March chill. 24 federal agents waited outside, but their weapons meant nothing here. This wasn't a raid. It was a negotiation between two organizations that understood power. Deputy Director Holloway. The voice came from behind a stack of shipping containers, male-controlled with the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised. You came alone. Smart man. Dutch stopped, setting the briefcase at his feet. Where are they? A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, well-dressed, moving with the casual confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. This wasn't some street-corner dealer. The man's suit cost more than most agents made in a month. Safe. For now. The man gestured to two chairs positioned under a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Sit. We have business. Dutch remained standing. I want proof of life first. The man smiled, pulling a Polaroid from his jacket. Helen Gandy and Clyde Tolson, though calling them his siblings. That's a creative interpretation of family, wouldn't you say? The photo showed Hoover's longtime secretary and associate director bound but unharmed. Dutch's jaw tightened. Helen and Clyde knew every secret the Bureau had buried for 5 decades. Every illegal wiretap, every blackmail file, every operation that would destroy the FBI if it went public. What do you want? To make a deal with reasonable men. The kidnapper gestured again to the chairs. Your boss died 2 months ago, left quite a mess behind. Files that could embarrass important people. Operations that might not look so patriotic in newspaper headlines. Dutch finally sat, placing the briefcase on his lap. The COINTELPRO files were sealed. The ones you know about, sure. The man's smile widened. But Edgar kept special files. Personal insurance policies. Helen knows where every single one is hidden. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Dutch understood now why this felt different from every other kidnapping case. This wasn't about money or political statements. It was about leverage, the kind that toppled governments. You're not some street crew, Dutch said slowly. The Black Mafia is many things, Deputy Director. We're businessmen. We understand that information is the most valuable commodity in America. The man leaned forward. Your predecessor learned that lesson well, built his entire career on it. Dutch's hand moved toward his service weapon, but the man raised a finger. Careful. Helen and Clyde's safety depends entirely on how this conversation goes. He nodded toward the briefcase. Show me what you brought. Dutch hesitated, then clicked open the locks. Inside lay a thick manila folder marked with classifications that most Americans would never see. The man pulled it closer, scanning the first page. COINTELPRO, Family Matters. He looked up. This is about the civil rights surveillance? Every illegal operation from 1956 to 1971. Wiretaps, break-ins, harassment campaigns. Enough to destroy the Bureau and put 50 agents in federal prison. Dutch's voice was steady despite the hammer of his pulse. You release Helen and Clyde, and these files disappear forever, along with anyone who might have read them. The man studied the documents for several minutes. When he looked up, something had changed in his expression. Not satisfaction, recognition. You FBI boys really don't know what you're dealing with, do you? He closed the folder. This is impressive, damaging, but it's not what we're after. Dutch felt ice form in his stomach. Then what? The personal files, the ones Edgar kept in his private safe. Helen knows the combination. The man stood, smoothing his jacket. Files about senators, judges, presidents, about business deals and political favors, about who really runs this country. Those files don't exist. Deputy Director, please, don't insult either of us. The man walked to the warehouse window, gazing out at the federal perimeter. J. Edgar Hoover ruled Washington for 48 years. You think he did that with law enforcement? Dutch's mouth went dry. Every agent knew the rumors about Hoover's secret files, the leverage that kept him untouchable despite 8 presidents trying to remove him. But seeing the files had been a privilege reserved for Hoover alone. Even if they exist, I don't have access. But Helen does. The man turned back. And here's what's going to happen. You're going to arrange for us to have a private conversation with Miss Gandy. She's going to tell us exactly where those files are hidden. And then we're all going to make sure they end up in the right hands. What hands? The man's smile turned cold. The ones that have been waiting 50 years to take control of what Edgar built. Dutch realized with growing horror that this wasn't a kidnapping at all. It was a coup, one that had been planned long before Hoover's death. And somehow, the FBI's most trusted deputy director had walked straight into the center of it. Dutch stared at the man's cold smile, feeling the warehouse walls close in around him. 42 years old, 20-year bureau veteran, and he'd walked into something that would either destroy the FBI or remake it entirely. The weight of his service weapon felt useless against his hip. 24 agents outside might as well have been toy soldiers for all the protection they offered now. You're suggesting someone inside the bureau orchestrated this, Dutch said, his voice barely echoing in the cavernous space. I'm stating a fact, Deputy Director. The man returned to his chair, settling with the casual comfort of someone who held all the cards. J. Edgar's death wasn't the end of an era. It was a changing of the guard. The question is whether you're smart enough to be part of the new order or if you'll go down with the old. Dutch's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Hoover had been untouchable for nearly 5 decades, survived 8 presidents who wanted him gone. That kind of survival required more than just competence. It required knowing where every body was buried in Washington. And if Helen Gandy truly knew the location of those files, even if I could arrange access to Helen, she'd never cooperate. Her loyalty to Hoover is touching but irrelevant. The man checked his watch, a gesture that felt more like a countdown than impatience. People's loyalties change when they understand the stakes. Miss Gandy has spent her entire career believing she was protecting American democracy. We're simply going to show her what she's really been protecting. The fluorescent bulb overhead flickered, casting unstable shadows across the concrete floor. Dutch caught a whiff of something else beneath the motor oil and rust, something sweet and sickening that made his stomach clench. Fear, he realized. His own fear, radiating through his sweat. What happens to Helen and Clyde after you get what you want? That depends entirely on how cooperative everyone proves to be. The man's fingers drummed against the manila folder. Your predecessor understood that certain secrets are too dangerous for public consumption. We're hoping you inherited that wisdom. Dutch thought of his wife Margaret, safe in their Georgetown apartment, probably grading papers from her high school English classes while she waited for him to come home. She'd been an agent's wife for 18 years, had learned not to ask too many questions about cases that kept him out past midnight. But this was different. This was the kind of case that followed you home, that poisoned everything it touched. My team knows where I am, Dutch said. If I don't check in, your team will be told that negotiations are proceeding and radio silence is necessary for the safety of the hostages. The man's smile never wavered. We've thought of everything, Deputy Director. That's what separates professionals from amateurs. The warehouse door creaked somewhere behind them, though Dutch saw no one emerge from the shadows. But the sound was enough to remind him that they weren't alone, that this careful conversation was being witnessed by people who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate loose ends. You want me to betray everything the Bureau stands for. I want you to save the Bureau from its own history. The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Edgar built something magnificent and terrible, an organization with the power to destroy presidents and topple governments. The question isn't whether that power should exist, it's who should wield it. Dutch's mouth had gone completely dry. Through the grimy warehouse window, he could see the faint glow of the federal perimeter lights. Agents positioned but helpless, his backup, his authority, his entire career reduced to a handful of people standing in the Philadelphia cold while he negotiated away the future of American law enforcement. How long do I have? To arrange the meeting with Miss Gandy? 24 hours. The man stood, smoothing his expensive jacket. After that, we'll be forced to demonstrate our commitment to this transaction. The threat hung in the stale air like smoke. Dutch understood that Helen and Clyde weren't just hostages. They were collateral in a war for the soul of the FBI itself. a war that had been planned in shadows and back rooms while Hoover's body was still warm. "One more thing, Deputy Director." The man paused at the edge of the circle of light. "When you speak to Miss Gandy, make sure she understands that this isn't personal. It's simply business, the kind of business Edgar would have respected." Dutch was left alone under the flickering bulb, surrounded by the echo of his own breathing and the growing certainty that he was about to become either a savior or a traitor. The briefcase full of COINTELPRO files sat useless at his feet. 40 years of FBI secrets rendered meaningless by the promise of something far more dangerous. In 7 days, one way or another, everything would be different. The drive back to Washington felt like a funeral procession. Dutch gripped the steering wheel of his Bureau sedan with white knuckles, the briefcase of useless COINTELPRO files rattling in the passenger seat with every pothole. The Philadelphia skyline receded in his rearview mirror, but the warehouse shadows seemed to follow him down I-95 like a plague. 24 hours. The deadline hammered against his skull in rhythm with the engine. 24 hours to convince Helen Gandy, Hoover's fierce protective secretary for 53 years, to hand over the location of files that could reshape American power forever, files that Helen had probably spent the past 2 months systematically destroying, just as she'd been doing with Hoover's personal papers since his death. Dutch pulled into Bureau headquarters at 3:47 a.m. The Hoover building loomed against the pre-dawn darkness, its brutalist architecture matching his mood perfectly. Most of the windows were dark, but Dutch knew the night shift would be monitoring communications, tracking cases that couldn't wait for daylight, normal cases, cases that didn't threaten to topple the entire federal law enforcement apparatus. His office felt foreign in the fluorescent gloom, the commendations on his walls, the photographs with presidents and attorneys general, they all seemed like props from someone else's life. Dutch slumped into his chair and stared at the secure phone that would connect him directly to Helen Gandy's apartment. The woman had been Hoover's gatekeeper for 5 decades. She'd controlled access to the most powerful man in Washington, had witnessed conversations that shaped history. If anyone knew where Hoover's most sensitive files were hidden, it was Helen. But she was also fiercely loyal to Hoover's memory and deeply suspicious of anyone trying to exploit his legacy. Dutch reached for the phone, then stopped. Something felt wrong, not just the warehouse meeting, everything. The timing of the kidnapping, the kidnappers' intimate knowledge of Bureau operations, their confidence that they could manipulate federal agents like chess pieces. He walked to his filing cabinet and pulled Helen's personnel file. 53 years of service, starting as a secretary in 1939 when she was 21 years old. No family, no significant relationships outside the Bureau. Her entire adult life had revolved around J. Edgar Hoover. Losing him 2 months ago had left her adrift, vulnerable in ways she'd probably never experienced. The phone rang. Dutch stared at it for 3 rings before picking up. Holloway. "Deputy Director." The voice was different from the warehouse. Younger, female, with a slight accent he couldn't place. "I hope your drive back was pleasant." Ice flooded his veins. They were watching him, had been watching him. "What do you want?" "To save you some time. Miss Gandy won't be taking your call." Dutch's hand tightened on the receiver. "What did you do to her?" "Nothing yet, but she received some interesting reading material this evening. Historical documents, you might say, about her beloved Edgar's recreational activities." The words hit Dutch like a physical blow. Hoover's sexual orientation had been whispered about in Washington circles for decades, but never proven, never documented. If they had photographs, evidence of his relationship with Clyde Tolson. "Helen Gandy is 74 years old, Dutch said, his voice deadly quiet. "Whatever you're planning is already in motion. Check your desk drawer, the locked one, bottom right." Dutch's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. That drawer contained his most sensitive case files, accessible only with a key he kept on his personal keychain. The keychain that hadn't left his possession all day. He unlocked the drawer with trembling fingers. Inside, beneath his usual files, lay a manila envelope that hadn't been there when he'd left for Philadelphia. His name was written across the front in elegant script. "Open it," the woman's voice commanded through the phone. Dutch tore open the envelope. Inside were 3 items that made his world tilt off its axis. A photograph of Hoover and Tolson in an intimate embrace, a handwritten letter on Hoover's personal stationery that detailed FBI operations that had never been authorized, and a list of Swiss bank account numbers with Hoover's signature. "These are forgeries," Dutch whispered, though even as he said it, he knew they weren't. The handwriting was too perfect, the details too accurate. Edgar wasn't just blackmailing politicians, Deputy Director. He was selling information to foreign governments, to organized crime, to anyone willing to pay his price. For 50 years, the director of the FBI was a traitor. Dutch sank into his chair, staring at documents that would destroy not just Hoover's reputation, but the Bureau's credibility forever. Every case they'd ever prosecuted would be questioned. Every conviction would face appeal. The FBI would be gutted from within by its own history. "Helen knows about all of this," the woman continued. "She's been protecting these secrets her entire career. The question is, will you help us bury them forever, or will you force us to make them public?" The phone went dead. Dutch sat in his dark office, surrounded by the weight of 50 years of lies, holding documents that proved America's most famous lawman had been corrupt to his core. Outside his window, Washington slept peacefully, unaware that its most sacred institutions were built on foundations of sand. He couldn't go back. Whatever choice he made in the next 20 to 3 hours would define not just his career, but his soul. The briefcase of COINTELPRO files suddenly seemed quaint, mere bureaucratic overreach compared to this systematic betrayal of everything the Bureau claimed to represent. Dutch looked at the secure phone again. In a few hours, he would have to call Helen Gandy and convince her to cooperate with the people who held these bombs. The people who had just made him an unwilling accomplice to the destruction of American justice. The old Dutch Holloway, the one who believed in law and order, who trusted the system he'd served for 20 years, was dead. What emerged from this office would be something else entirely. Dutch stared at the damning documents until the words blurred together, his eyes burning from the fluorescent lights and the weight of impossible choices. Dawn was creeping through his office windows, painting the Washington skyline in shades of gray that matched his mood. He'd been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours, paralyzed by the magnitude of what lay before him. This can't be real. The thought had cycled through his mind dozens of times since the phone went dead. J. Edgar Hoover, the man who'd built the modern FBI, who'd become synonymous with American law enforcement, couldn't have been a traitor. The evidence had to be fabricated, no matter how authentic it looked. Dutch reached for his secure phone, then pulled his hand back. He'd started to call Helen Gandy 6 times, and 6 times he'd stopped. What would he say? "Hello, Helen. Some very dangerous people want you to hand over files that prove your boss of 53 years was selling state secrets." Instead, he tried a different approach. Maybe he could fix this without involving Helen at all. Dutch pulled his contact list and found the number for Thomas Bishop, Assistant Director of Intelligence Division. Tom had been close to Hoover, had access to sensitive files. If anyone could verify whether these documents were legitimate, Bishop residence. The voice was thick with sleep. "Tom, it's Dutch Holloway. I need to see you. Now." A pause. "Jesus, Dutch, it's not even 6 a.m. What's?" "It's about the director, about files. I can't discuss it over the phone." Another pause, longer this time. When Tom spoke again, his voice had changed. "Become careful. I think you should talk to Helen about that." "Tom, listen to me. I really think Helen is the person you need to call, Dutch. She's the authority on anything related to the director's personal papers." The line went dead. Dutch stared at the phone. Tom Bishop had been a straight shooter for 25 years, never backed down from a hard conversation, but the fear in his voice had been unmistakable. The careful way he'd emphasized Helen's name, like he was delivering a coded message. He tried 2 more numbers. Same result. Agents who'd served under Hoover for decades suddenly developed amnesia when it came to the director's files. Men who'd charged into armed confrontations without blinking became evasive and nervous at the mention of Hoover's personal papers. They already know. The realization hit Dutch like a physical blow. These weren't random kidnappings designed to pressure him. This was orchestrated, planned. How many people in the Bureau were already compromised? His secretary knocked and entered with coffee in the morning briefing folders. "You're in early, sir. The Philadelphia situation?" Still developing. Dutch tried to keep his voice steady. Linda, I need you to place a call to Helen Gandy. Tell her I need to see her this morning. Urgent bureau business. Linda nodded and left. Dutch forced himself to review the morning reports, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy while his world crumbled around him. Drug raids in Detroit. Bank robbery task force updates. Congressional testimony preparations. The mundane business of law enforcement continued while the foundation of the FBI rotted beneath everyone's feet. 20 minutes later, Linda returned. Her usually cheerful demeanor had vanished. Sir? Miss Gandy's line has been disconnected. I called the building superintendent. She didn't come home last night. Dutch's coffee turned to acid in his stomach. What do you mean, didn't come home? The superintendent said 2 men came by yesterday evening. They had bureau credentials, said they needed to escort Miss Gandy for security reasons. Linda's voice was tight with worry. They left with her around 7 p.m. The warehouse meeting had been theater. Street criminals demanding files they couldn't possibly understand. While Dutch had been negotiating with shadows, the real players had already moved on Helen Gandy. Had probably been planning this since the moment Hoover's heart stopped beating. Cancel my morning appointments, Dutch said quietly. And Linda? Not a word about this conversation to anyone. She nodded and hurried out. Dutch could see the questions in her eyes, the growing awareness that something terrible was happening. How long before that awareness spread through the entire building? How long before the FBI tore itself apart with suspicion and fear? The secure phone rang. Dutch let it ring twice before answering. You tried to go around us. The woman's voice carried a note of disappointment. That was unwise, Deputy Director. Where is she? Safe, for now. But your colleagues' reactions were instructive. It seems more people know about Edgar's activities than we initially calculated. A pause. Tell me how many agents refused to discuss the director's files with you? Dutch said nothing. All of them, I imagine. 50 years of loyal service and they scattered like roaches when you turned on the lights. Makes you wonder what else they've been hiding, doesn't it? The truth hit Dutch with devastating clarity. This wasn't about money or political leverage. Someone was systematically dismantling the FBI from within, using Hoover's own secrets as weapons. And they'd chosen Dutch, trusted, loyal, naive Dutch Holloway, to be their unwitting instrument of destruction. The silence on the phone stretched like a taut wire. Dutch could hear the woman breathing, waiting for him to absorb the full implications of what she'd revealed. The FBI wasn't just being attacked. It was being surgically dissected by someone who understood its anatomy better than any outsider ever could. Your bureau, Dutch said finally. The words felt like glass in his throat. Was bureau. Until Edgar decided my loyalty had an expiration date. Her voice carried decades of buried rage. Do you know what it's like to serve faithfully for 20 years, only to watch your director sell state secrets while lecturing agents about patriotism? To see him destroy careers over moral failings while he photographed himself in compromising positions with foreign assets? Dutch's hand trembled as he set down his coffee. Through his office window, he could see early commuters streaming toward the metro stations, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their faith in American justice was about to be shattered. What do you want? Justice. The kind Edgar never allowed. Papers rustled in the background. Helen Gandy isn't just his secretary, deputy director. She's his accomplice. For 30 years, she facilitated his sales of classified intelligence. Swiss bank accounts, encrypted communications with Soviet handlers' photographs documenting sexual blackmail of senators and Supreme Court justices. She kept the ledgers, managed the dead drops, even helped stage his public persona as America's moral guardian. The documents on Dutch's desk suddenly felt radioactive. The evidence you showed me is barely a fraction of what exists. Helen has spent the last 2 months trying to destroy the archives, but Edgar was too paranoid to keep everything in one location. He had insurance policies scattered across the country, insurance against his own organization turning on him. Dutch thought of Helen Gandy's personnel file. 53 years of perfect service records, commendations, salary increases that had gradually elevated her from typist to the most powerful unelected woman in Washington. All of it built on a foundation of treason. "The kidnappings in Philadelphia," Dutch said slowly. "Helen and Clyde aren't random targets." Clyde Tolson was Edgar's lover and his business partner. Together, they built a shadow network that reached into every major criminal organization in America. The Mafia, corrupt unions, foreign intelligence services. Edgar didn't fight organized crime, he franchised it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And Helen has the client list. Dutch's secure phone line, the most protected communication system in federal law enforcement, suddenly felt like a party line. How many conversations had been monitored over the years? How many operations had been compromised before they began? You're asking me to help you murder them. I'm asking you to help me expose 50 years of institutional betrayal before it metastasizes further." The woman's tone hardened. "Edgar is dead, but his network isn't. Right now, there are bureau executives selling case files to defense attorneys. There are agents providing advance warning to criminals under federal investigation. The corruption Edgar normalized has become the FBI's operating culture." Dutch thought of his morning phone calls, the careful fear in Tom Bishop's voice, the way decorated agents had suddenly developed selective amnesia about their director's activities. How deep did this go? How many people he trusted were already compromised? Helen will never cooperate. She's devoted her entire life to protecting Hoover's reputation. Helen will cooperate because the alternative is watching Edgar's legacy burn in public. Papers rustled again. "We have enough evidence to destroy every major case the Bureau has prosecuted in the last decade. Every conviction, every sentence, every family that believed they received justice. All of it becomes meaningless when the American people learn their premier law enforcement agency has been a criminal enterprise." The magnitude hit Dutch like a physical blow. Thousands of families who trusted the system. Victims of organized crime, terrorism, corruption. All of them betrayed by the very institution they depended on for protection. The FBI wouldn't just be disbanded. It would become a symbol of everything wrong with American power. "There's another way," Dutch said desperately. "We could investigate quietly, build cases, clean house internally." "With what evidence?" Edgar spent 5 decades perfecting the art of institutional protection. Every potential whistleblower was either corrupted, transferred, or eliminated. The few honest agents left are too junior to access the real files, and the executives are all compromised. Her laugh was bitter. "You tried to verify the documents I sent. How many colleagues took your calls?" Dutch closed his eyes. The answer was 0. In a building full of federal agents supposedly dedicated to truth and justice, not one person was willing to discuss their dead director's activities with his deputy. "I need guarantees. About Helen and Clyde's safety. You'll get them. Once Helen provides the location of Edgar's primary archives. And after that? After that, Deputy Director, we begin the careful work of rebuilding American law enforcement. Starting with the truth about what it became under Edgar's leadership." The line went dead, leaving Dutch alone with the weight of 50 years of lies. Dutch sat motionless at his desk for several minutes after the line went dead, staring at the classified documents that had rewritten everything he thought he knew about his career, his purpose, his life. The woman's words echoed in his mind. Edgar spent 5 decades perfecting the art of institutional protection. But something nagged at him, a detail that didn't align with the careful narrative she'd constructed. Dutch pulled out his personal files, 20 years of performance reviews, commendations, and assignment records. He traced his finger down the timeline, looking for the pattern he'd missed. There, 1968. His promotion to deputy director hadn't come through normal channels. It had been fast-tracked, approved personally by Hoover, despite Dutch having less seniority than 6 other qualified candidates. At the time, he'd assumed it was recognition of his work on organized crime cases. Dutch opened his locked filing cabinet and retrieved his original assignment folder from 1952. Fresh out of law school, recruited directly into the Bureau by Hoover himself during a university visit. Another anomaly he'd never questioned. Hundreds of graduates had been in that auditorium, but Hoover had personally approached him afterward, had remembered his name, his background, his father's military service record. Dutch's blood turned cold as the pieces assembled themselves. His father hadn't just served in World War II, he'd been OSS, Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. And he died in 1947, not in a training accident as Dutch had been told his entire life, but in Budapest. Dutch had only learned the truth by accident, finding classified documents while researching an unrelated case in 1965. The phone rang. Dutch stared at it, knowing with absolute certainty that answering would change everything again. Deputy Director. The woman's voice was different now, softer, almost gentle. "I think you've been doing some research." "My father," Dutch said quietly. OSS operative Daniel Holloway discovered Edgar's first international sale in 1947, weapons specifications to Soviet contacts in Hungary. "Your father tried to report it through proper channels." A pause. "He was eliminated before he could testify to the House Intelligence Committee." The room tilted around Dutch. 25 years of serving the man who'd murdered his father. 25 years of believing he was honoring his father's memory by upholding American justice when all along he'd been protecting his father's killer. "Edgar recruited you specifically because of your parentage," the woman continued. "He wanted to prove he could corrupt even the son of the man he'd killed. Turn you into a willing participant in the system that had destroyed your family." Dutch remembered Hoover's paternal interest in his career, the private meetings, the way the director had always emphasized Dutch's potential for greatness within the Bureau. Not mentorship, psychological torture, a decades-long demonstration of Hoover's power to shape reality itself. "You knew," Dutch whispered. "From the beginning, you knew who I was. I've been watching you for a very long time, Marcus, waiting for the right moment to help you understand what you've really been serving." Her voice carried a note of genuine sympathy now. "Your father was my partner. OSS assigned us to investigate Soviet penetration of American intelligence services. We were getting close to exposing Edgar's network when he had my father killed." The words felt like broken glass. "And you've been planning this revenge ever since." "Not revenge. Justice. The kind your father died trying to deliver." She paused. "Edgar didn't just betray his country, Marcus. He perverted the very concept of law enforcement. He turned the FBI into his personal instrument of power and profit. Every oath you've taken, every case you've worked, every moment you've spent believing you were protecting innocent people, it's all been built on your father's grave." Dutch looked around his office, at the awards and commendations that lined the walls. 20 years of distinguished service to a lie. 20 years of enabling the man who'd orphaned him at age 7. The irony was so perfect, so deliberately crafted, that he could almost admire Hoover's perverse genius. "Helen and Clyde don't know about my father." "Helen knows everything. She processed the termination orders personally." The woman's voice hardened again. "She's not an innocent secretary caught in larger events, Marcus. She's been Edgar's willing accomplice since 1945. Every death, every betrayal, every corruption of justice, she facilitated it all." Dutch closed his eyes and saw his father's face, preserved forever in a photograph on his childhood dresser. A proud man in uniform, believing he served something greater than himself, dying alone in a foreign city because he'd discovered that America's most famous lawman was a traitor. The phone crackled with static. When the woman spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass decades of grief and rage. "The question now, Marcus, is simple. Will you help me finish what your father started? Or will you continue protecting the man who destroyed your family?" Dutch stared at the documents on his desk, evidence of Hoover's crimes, proof of his father's murder, and the terrible knowledge that his entire adult life had been orchestrated as an act of revenge against a dead man. For the first time in 20 years, he knew exactly what he had to do. Dutch's hands moved with steady precision as he opened his office safe and began removing files. 20 years of carefully maintained records that suddenly took on new meaning. Personnel evaluations where he'd unknowingly protected Hoover's operatives. Budget approvals that had funded illegal surveillance operations. Transfer orders that had silenced potential whistleblowers by scattering them across remote field offices. He'd been the perfect inside man precisely because he'd never known he was one. "I'll need operational details," Dutch said into the phone. His voice was steady now, stripped of the uncertainty that had plagued him for days. Timeline, logistics, guarantees for Helen and Clyde's safety. If we're going to expose 50 years of institutional betrayal, we do it right. I was hoping you'd say that. The woman's relief was audible. There's a safe deposit box in Helen's name at First National Bank of Georgetown, box 847. She visits it every Tuesday at precisely 2 p.m., has for the past 15 years. That's where Edgar kept his insurance policies. Dutch checked his calendar. Today was Monday. Security protocols? 2 guards, standard bank surveillance, but Helen has established patterns. She's always alone, always uses the same entrance. A pause. The box contains location codes for 17 different archive sites, communications logs going back to 1947, financial records documenting payments to foreign assets, everything needed to dismantle Edgar's network completely. The weight of it settled on Dutch's shoulders like lead. 17 archive sites meant hundreds of operatives, thousands of compromised cases, decades of American foreign policy built on corrupted intelligence. The damage assessment alone would take years. There's something else, the woman continued. Edgar didn't just sell intelligence to the Soviets. He provided similar services to organized crime families, foreign governments, defense contractors, anyone willing to pay his prices. The FBI became a marketplace where justice was auctioned to the highest bidder. Dutch thought of every major case he'd worked, every conviction he'd secured, every moment he'd felt pride in serving American justice. How many of those victories had been orchestrated by Hoover's puppet strings? How many criminals had walked free because they'd purchased FBI protection? My father's case files, Dutch said. Do they still exist? Hidden in Edgar's personal archive, along with the files of every other agent who got too close to the truth. Her voice softened again. He kept trophies, Marcus. Photographs, personal effects, final reports. 23 federal agents eliminated over 5 decades, and Edgar preserved mementos of each kill. The number hit Dutch like a physical blow. 23 families told their loved ones had died in training accidents, car crashes, random violence. 23 funerals where mourners had honored fallen heroes without knowing they'd been murdered by the institution they'd served. Helen processed those termination orders too? Every one. She maintained the death benefits paperwork, coordinated the cover stories, even sent condolence letters to the families. The woman's voice carried an edge of disgust. Edgar may have given the orders, but Helen made sure they looked legitimate on paper. Dutch found himself thinking of Helen Gandy's reputation within the Bureau, the devoted secretary who'd sacrificed personal happiness to serve the greater good. Unmarried, childless, dedicated entirely to preserving Hoover's legacy and institutional memory. In truth, she'd been the chief archivist of a criminal enterprise. Tomorrow afternoon, then. Dutch was surprised by the calm in his own voice. But I want to talk to Helen personally before any public exposure. She deserves the chance to cooperate willingly. Cooperation isn't really her strength, Marcus. Edgar chose her specifically because of her absolute loyalty. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, she'll protect his reputation above everything else. Maybe. But my father believed in due process, even for traitors. Dutch closed the safe and locked it. Helen gets one chance to do the right thing. After that, we follow your timeline. The silence stretched between them. When the woman spoke again, her voice carried something Dutch hadn't heard before. Respect. Your father would be proud. He spent his last weeks trying to find a way to expose Edgar without destroying public faith in American institutions entirely. You're continuing his work. Dutch looked at his father's photograph, now understanding the weight the man had carried. Discovering that America's most famous lawman was a traitor, knowing the exposure would devastate public trust in law enforcement, but unable to let the corruption continue. It was an impossible choice that had cost him everything. After tomorrow, assuming we get those archives, what's your estimate for controlled exposure timeline? 6 months, minimum. We'll need to coordinate with Justice Department prosecutors, congressional oversight committees, intelligence community leadership. This can't be a document dump. It has to be surgical. She paused. But Marcus, once we start this process, there's no stopping it. Hoover's network will fight back with everything they have. People will die rather than let this truth come out. Dutch understood. He was about to declare war on an organization he'd served faithfully for 20 years. Former colleagues would become enemies. The institution he'd devoted his life to building would have to be torn down and rebuilt from nothing. But his father's ghost demanded justice. And somewhere in America, 22 other families deserved to know how their heroes had really died. "I'll be ready," Dutch said, and meant it. The secure line buzzed at exactly 6 a.m. Dutch answered before the first ring finished, his coffee already cold, his resolve hardened by a sleepless night of planning. "There's been a development." The woman's voice was sharp with urgency. Helen moved up her schedule. "She's at the bank now, has been there since opening." Something spooked her. Dutch was already reaching for his coat. "How long do we have?" "Unknown. My contact inside says she's been in the vault for over an hour. That's unprecedented." A pause. "Marcus, I think she knows we're coming." The drive to Georgetown took 12 minutes through empty morning streets. Dutch parked across from First National Bank and watched through his windshield as a black sedan pulled up to the side entrance. His blood chilled as he recognized the driver, Agent Tom Bishop, his most trusted subordinate, the man he'd called friend for 15 years. "She's not alone," Dutch said into his radio. "I see him." "That's not good, Marcus. Bishop's been on Edgar's payroll since 1965. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Bishop's careful questions about Dutch's recent activities, his nervous energy during their last conversation, the way he'd deflected every inquiry about Hoover's final days. Dutch had confided in Bishop about the mysterious documents, had shared his growing suspicions about institutional corruption. He'd unknowingly been reporting to the enemy. "How many others?" Dutch asked. "In your immediate circle?" "3 that we know of, possibly more." The woman's voice carried grim certainty. Edgar didn't just corrupt the bureau from the top down. He built a cellular network of operatives at every level, each one believing they were protecting national security while actually serving his private interests. Dutch watched Bishop emerge from the bank, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the street with professional paranoia. In his hand was a metal briefcase that hadn't been there when he entered. Whatever Helen had retrieved from that safe deposit box was now in enemy hands. "The archives," Dutch said. "Probably just the location codes. The actual materials are still scattered across 17 sites." The woman paused. "But now they know we're close. They'll start moving everything within hours." Dutch's radio crackled as Bishop climbed back into his sedan. Through his earpiece, he could hear a second conversation. Bishop reporting to someone else, coordinates being exchanged, cleanup protocols being activated. After 20 years of partnership, Dutch was listening to his closest colleague arrange his elimination. "They're going to burn it all," the woman continued. "Every document, every piece of evidence, every trace of Edgar's network. In 24 hours, proving any of this will become impossible." Dutch started his engine and began following Bishop's sedan at a careful distance. The route was familiar, south through downtown, toward the Virginia suburbs where several bureau safe houses maintained document storage facilities. Bishop was leading him directly to at least one of the archive sites. "Change of plans," Dutch said into the radio. "I'm going to force their hand. Marcus, that's suicide. Bishop has backup units stationed throughout the city. You'd be outnumbered 10-1. Not if I make this public first." Dutch reached for his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of photocopied documents, insurance copies he'd made of everything the woman had sent him. "How long would it take you to get these to the Washington Post?" The silence stretched for several seconds. When the woman spoke again, her voice carried grudging admiration. 40 minutes if I use emergency protocols. But once this breaks, there's no controlling the narrative. It'll be chaos. Better chaos than complete cover-up." Dutch watched Bishop's sedan turn into the parking lot of a nondescript office building in Alexandria. "Besides, my father didn't die, so these secrets could stay buried forever. What about Helen? She's still at the bank." Dutch considered this. Helen Gandy had spent 50 years as Hoover's enabler, had processed murder orders and maintained files on every corruption. But she was also a 70-year-old woman who devoted her life to what she believed was protecting America's security interests. The revelation that her entire career had been built on treason would destroy her as completely as it had destroyed Dutch. Give her 1 hour, Dutch decided. 1 hour to come forward voluntarily before the story breaks. She deserves that much dignity. And Bishop. Dutch parked across the street from the storage facility and watched his former friend disappear through a side entrance. In a few minutes, Dutch would follow him inside and confront the truth about 20 years of manipulated friendship. Either Bishop would surrender the briefcase and cooperate with exposure efforts, or Dutch would take it by force. Bishop made his choice 15 years ago, Dutch said quietly. Now he gets to live with the consequences. The radio clicked off, leaving Dutch alone with the weight of what came next. In 1 hour, the Washington Post would expose 50 years of institutional betrayal. The FBI would be disbanded within a week. Hundreds of cases would be overturned. Public faith in federal law enforcement would collapse entirely. But his father's ghost would finally have justice. Dutch sat in his parked car for 37 minutes, watching emergency vehicles arrive at what had once been a storage facility. The explosion had been visible from 6 blocks away, a controlled demolition that eliminated not just documents, but the entire building that housed them. Bishop's final act of loyalty to a dead master. The radio crackled with news updates. The Washington Post had broken the story at exactly noon, their headlines stark and unforgiving. FBI founded on treason. Hoover archives reveal 5 decades of espionage. Within hours, every major network was running special broadcasts. Congressional leaders demanded immediate investigations. The president had placed the entire bureau under emergency oversight. Dutch's phone rang constantly. Reporters, former colleagues, congressional staffers. He let them all go to voicemail. There would be time for testimony later, for explaining how he'd been an unwitting participant in his father's betrayal. Right now, he needed to drive home to his farmhouse and sit with the weight of what he'd destroyed. The Virginia countryside looked different now, as if the revelation had changed the fundamental nature of light itself. Fields that had seemed peaceful yesterday now felt haunted by the ghosts of agents who'd died trying to expose the truth. Dutch counted telephone poles as he drove, remembering how his father used to make that same journey, carrying secrets that would eventually kill him. Helen Gandy had taken her own life 20 minutes before the story broke. A single gunshot in her Georgetown apartment, surrounded by 50 years of meticulous records she'd maintained for a man who'd never deserved her devotion. Dutch felt an unexpected sadness for her. Another victim of Hoover's corruption, destroyed by loyalty to an illusion. Bishop's body had been found in the storage facility's rubble. Whether he'd died in the explosion or taken his own life remained unclear, but Dutch suspected the latter. There had always been honor in Bishop beneath the manipulation, a genuine belief that he was protecting something worth preserving. Learning that his entire career had served treason would have been unbearable. The farmhouse felt smaller when Dutch finally arrived, as if the day's revelations had compressed its walls. He poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his father's chair, the one piece of furniture he'd kept from childhood, staring at the photograph that had dominated his dresser for 60 years. "Did you know?" Dutch asked the silence. "Did you know what finding the truth would cost?" The evening news carried footage of FBI headquarters being sealed by federal marshals. Director Richardson had resigned via press conference, his face gray with the knowledge that his entire agency would need to be rebuilt from nothing. Congressional leaders spoke of establishing a new federal investigative service with completely different oversight structures. The FBI, as Dutch had known it, would cease to exist within a week. His phone rang at sunset. The woman's voice, no longer filtered through electronic distortion. "It's over," she said simply. "Is it?" Dutch watched darkness settle over his father's land. 23 families still don't know how their loved ones really died. Hundreds of Soviet assets are still embedded in American intelligence services. Hoover's network won't just disappear because we exposed its leader. "No," she agreed, "but now we can fight them in the light instead of shadows. Your father would have been proud, Marcus. You finished what he started." Dutch wasn't sure about that. His father had been a hero who died trying to save his country's honor. Dutch was just a broken man who'd finally learned he'd been serving his family's killers for 20 years. The mathematics of justice didn't balance. After the call ended, Dutch walked to his father's grave. a simple headstone in the family cemetery behind the farmhouse. He'd visited that grave thousands of times over the decades, usually carrying guilt about his inadequacies as a son and agent. Tonight, he brought something different, the knowledge that Daniel Holloway had died a patriot, murdered by traitors who'd spent half a century desecrating his sacrifice. "I'm sorry it took so long," Dutch said to the marble stone. "I'm sorry I served them while you waited for justice." The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves from neighboring farms. Somewhere in America, families were learning that their heroes hadn't died accidentally. Somewhere else, Soviet handlers were destroying evidence of their American assets. The story Dutch had helped expose would reverberate for years, destroying institutions and rebuilding others, forcing a reckoning with 50 years of corrupted justice. Dutch had thought pursuing the truth would bring him peace. Instead, it had given him a different burden, the responsibility of helping rebuild what he'd helped tear down. Tomorrow, he would testify before Congress. Next week, he would help design new oversight structures for federal law enforcement. For the rest of his life, he would carry the knowledge of how completely he'd been deceived by men he'd trusted. But tonight, in the gathering darkness of his father's land, Dutch felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the certainty that he was finally serving the right cause. The dead could rest, the living would rebuild, and justice, though delayed by 5 decades, had finally found its way home.